Hello, kind people. This is Peter Svidler on the rest day in Vaikanze, recording a recap video for round 10. And this video once again will feature a game that the young Iranian prodigy Alireza Firouzja played against the world's elite. In round 10, he played his first ever game with the black pieces. First ever game, and this time with the black pieces against the world's number 2, Fabiano Caruana. So let's have a look at the game. And there you see lifetime record, no record up until that moment. Some background, if you haven't been following the Vaikanze tournament closely, Alireza has been playing excellently well until the second rest day, and he actually led the tournament outright. But in round 9, he lost a somewhat unpleasant game to the world champion Magnus Carlsen, where he got thoroughly outplayed in a closed Spanish. And playing black against Caruana the next day is arguably not the greatest pairing in the world, and you could approach it in a variety of ways if you were in Firouzja's spot. And I think it's very admirable to see exactly how he approached it. So let's have a look at the game. d4, Fabio obviously can play anything he wants on move 1, but he chooses one d4, knight f6, c4, and g6, knight c3, bishop g7. Alireza has a reasonably varied opening repertoire, but the King's Indian is one of the things he plays, and not a huge surprise that he chooses it, but still you could go for something less double-edged and more solid. e4, d6, and here Fabi chooses a somewhat trendy line with h3 castles and bishop e3. I really am not a King's Indian specialist and wouldn't dream of giving some kind of an expose on why this is good and what exactly the plans here are, but this is something that people have been doing recently. There's a lot of variations in the King's Indian these days where white plays h3, actually aiming to play reasonably early g4 in many positions where, you know, the older generations of the King's Indian players wouldn't have dreamt of doing this to their structure. But the understanding that you can play h3 and g4 in many positions is one of the quite obvious developments in recent chess. And Alireza goes knight c6, probably one of the sharpest replies to h3 bishop e3. He also played it quite quickly, which I suspect indicates that he knew a little bit of something at the very least about this h3 bishop e3 line. And there is, I looked briefly at the historical record, and perhaps not shockingly, this line with knight c6 has been played by Tata, another promising Iranian youngster, in 2018, and that game went knight g2, and here black sort of shows what the intention is. e5, d5, knight d4, seemingly blundering a pawn, and then knight takes e4, with the intention of meeting both knight takes e4 and somewhat more funnily, even bishop takes g7 with the move rook e8. And after knight e4, rook e8, f3, f5, the game was eventually drawn in the game between Zhou and Tata in 2018. Fabi replies with d5, which has to be the most critical reply. Knight e5, prompting more extension from white. In this position, Hampi Canero played bishop d3, which I think is a logical move. You would like probably to play knight f3, but I think knight f3 is quite well met by the move knight h5. And suddenly, it's actually not that easy for white to do something constructive with the threat of knight g3, which could be quite discomforting. So I think starting with bishop d3, specifically white intends to develop this knight to e2, covering those squares. And Hampi's opponent played e5, d, fe. Hampi played g4 here, and castled queenside, and there was a very sharp position on the board by move 14, which is somewhat reminiscent of positions people sometimes get in the third f3 Grunfelds. Just briefly for reference sake, there is a somewhat topical line of the f3 Grunfeld, which goes like this. e4, d6, here knight c3, bishop g7, f4, knight d7. And here the main line is supposed to be some combination of bishop e2 and knight h3, f2. and you often in these positions get some kind of a structure like this. And white does indeed often castle queenside in positions like the one you see on your screen. But Fabiano had a very concrete and very ambitious solution here, g2, g4, which I don't exactly know what to think about this, because it's a very committal move and it's a very ambitious move, but it leads to very unclear positions, and let's put it like this: it's very easy for white to go wrong here, and I think Fabiano himself probably didn't look at this position very closely prior to this game, because I think he made some moves which looked natural, which weren't the best. And somewhat more interestingly, I believe that the Firouzja camp, or Firouzja himself, probably did look at g4 in some detail, because he very quickly played c6, knight f3, cd5, cd5. This is not really a difficult decision. And here he played b6, which was also played quite quickly. Maybe you can make an argument that it's maybe close to the only move black can make, but still I thought the speed with which he made such a committal decision, because obviously giving up control over the c6 square is a great big deal in positions like this, shows some level of preparation. The reason you need to play b6 is that you would like to put the knight on c5, of course, but if you do it instantly, the white center is just so completely unchallengeable in a position like this that white will be extremely happy here. So you're preparing to play knight c5 next move, and you need to be able to take with the b pawn. And in this position, somewhat surprisingly, the computers actually suggest restraint. They suggest that you can play something like bishop g2, knight c5, and queen c2, aiming to castle actually kingside, and only castle queenside if black wastes a tempo on bishop a6, because obviously allowing knight d3 check is not great. And after, let's say, bishop b7, castles e6, rook knight d4, rook c8, rook d1, the computers indicate that this is quite pleasant for white, although of course black is not without resources here. But Fabi made the most natural move in the position here, knight d4, knight c5, and here the move that Fabi chose is, it looks very logical, but is in fact, I think, if you want to judge it harshly, it was flat out a mistake. He played queen f3, which is a logical move because putting the bishop on g2 here would allow bishop a6. Once again, knight d3 ideas are annoying, and controlling this diagonal makes a lot of sense. We're also preparing to castle queenside, play king b1, and solve the issues with the king on e1 that way. But black had a very strong option here, which I think gives him at least comfortable equality. Although talking about equality in a position like the one we see on our board here is a bit stupid, because 0, 0, 0 means nothing here. It's going to be a mess regardless. There's really nothing I've seen on my screen when I tried analyzing this in preparation for this video. At no point do positions become simple. The computer might say it is eventually equal, but they always remain incredibly messy. Instead of queen f3, just to put this position to bed, so to speak, the computer suggests playing knight c6, which is not a huge surprise, queen e8, and now defending the pawn on e4 with bishop g2. As I mentioned, black instantly plays bishop a6. And I think this is why Fabi didn't play it, because in this position the computer suggests just giving up our proud bishop on e3. Now the bishop on g7 seemingly is completely unopposed, and structurally this is very scary for white, to be honest, because this is potentially a huge monster. But the reason the computer likes it is the very specific idea of playing queen c2, knight d7, and now actually instantly closing down this bishop by playing e5, de, and long castles. And white is aiming to include the h1 rook in the game, next move basically, by playing rook he1. And black is a pawn up and can even take another one. But the white dominance and the absolute monster white currently has on c6 and the white dominance in the center are very, very good compensation for the sacrifice material. And as a matter of fact, computers seem to prefer this quite a bit for white because of how awkward the black position currently is. Black has very nice positional trumps of his own. The bishop on g7 is very strong, and extra pawn and so on. But this very, very concrete tactical solution here seems to be quite strong. But I think it's just very, very difficult to move past the idea of playing bishop takes e5 here. It's not a move that very many people would be happy making in a practical game. So Fabi played queen f3, and this is where Alireza went for a position which we liked him going for it in the live show because of how interesting and messy it is. But he could have played e7, e6 here, which also leads to very, very interesting, very sharp positions. And it is, I think, the stronger option of the two. And white, his center is now severely challenged. You can never really take on e6 because I suspect even the immediate bishop b7 might be interesting. But just on general grounds, if black goes fe and then bishop b7, the pawn on e4 is under tremendous pressure. So the choice here has to be between g5, knight h5, and something like castles long, after which black takes on d5. And one illustration of just how difficult white's life becomes very, very quick here is this line, takes, king b1, and black already has a very cute shot here. Knight g3, attacking everything, white takes, black takes here, and this guy falls, and black is already in complete control. So after e5, computer suggests you have to play knight c6, and now black is completely fine after d4, and maybe even more fine after queen e8, knight takes d5, bishop b7, knight c7 check, and king h8. I tried figuring out what's happening here, did not really get very far. White plays f5, black plays bishop b5, and honestly, this is not a position you can ever assess with a naked eye, so to speak. You have to continue clicking, and eventually maybe you'll get to some conclusion. I let it run for a while, and it said king b1, knight takes e4, using once again the strength of this X-ray, and white just plays f5, f6 here. And the computer, after on depth 40 or thereabouts, was saying that this is around equal. And this is a kind of equality that I referred to early in the video. This might be 0-0-0. This might be actually equal with best play, but like nobody really calls this equal. It's just a mess where we ask the computer's answer, and the computer's answer is what we are used to, basically. Namely, nobody is better. But to go back, after queen f3, Alireza chose bishop b7, also a very normal move, preparing for knight c6, preparing those same breaks with e6. But now white has the move g5, and clearly bishop b7 was played with only one intention in mind: knight f takes e4. You can still make other moves here. You can go knight h5, you can go knight d7, but clearly Alireza was not interested in any of those. He wanted this piece sacrifice. And this is also what I meant when I said that I was quite impressed by his approach to a game after a painful loss here, playing against world's #2. He clearly went all out to play as messy a position as possible and play it as sharply for all three results as possible. But here, at the call light of the day, after takes, queen takes d5, rook e8, and a very strong move knight c2, you could try playing queen f3 instead, but then queen e7 more or less forces knight c2 anyway, and there's really no reason for white not to play knight c2 straight away. Fg and long castles, gf, and maybe Alireza from some way away thought that he is maybe even better, because obviously white does not want to take here and run into this double attack. But after bishop d4, the computer still thinks this is around equal, but I think long term it's easier to play this position with white. And also, I think Alireza approached it slightly in a wrong fashion. I think what you're really supposed to do here is not just not to hang on to the pawn on d6, but to actually actively encourage white to take it so that we can start playing an endgame of some sort. One of the lines the computer suggests in order to get there is rook c8, bishop b5, rook e7, king b1. Now we take on d4, queen takes d4, and black just immediately stops protecting this guy and starts only protecting this guy. And it feels to me like white probably actually takes here. We take, we play king g7, And this is an incredibly sharp endgame, which once again, it's very possible that the machine will just say this is equal, but this is absolutely anybody's game, because if these pawns ever actually start rolling, you obviously instantly start preferring black, and white's for now does not really have any play on the queen side. The structure is quite supple, and white has sort of the wrong bishop to attack these pawns. So at least for the first part of this endgame, white will be mainly concerned with containment and hoping to prevent any kind of black's advances on the king side. Alireza took on d4 straight away instead. Queen takes d4. During the live show, I was making an argument for knight takes d4, but that's actually just plain wrong because of how awkward the move the knight on e4 is, with all these squares being attacked, and it's just not easy for white to make moves in a position like this. So queen d4 is correct, and here once again, the move knight e6 also doesn't protect the pawn on d6, but it's I think it's the start of a slightly wrong direction from Alireza, because you close down your own open file, and also you're really not forcing white to simplify. And the computer here gives us two main options. I think the one he likes the most is to play queen h4, let's say king b1, rook ac8. As you can see, just completely ignoring the fact that d6 is hanging. Eventually white probably will have to take it, if for no other reason than to just undermine the rook on e5, queen d6. And now the computer brings the queen over to f5. Some kind of position like this arises, and this is where I stopped clicking, because really it does a little bit seem like we're making random moves which are very difficult to explain why exactly these moves are stronger than than every other move in this position. But the relevant part is the computer does not believe that white is better here at all, which is really not that surprising. 3 pawns for the piece. We've given up the one weakness on d6. All of our pieces are reasonably active. The king is safe on g8. No real reason for black to be worse here. And the other line which I sort of liked for black here as well was rook e4, queen d5, rook e5. Once again saying, please take on d6. I really would like to get the queens off and start playing this endgame. And queen f3 is the computer's suggestion. Now we obviously don't give up this guy. King b1, rook c8, bishop a6, rook c5. And compared to the position Alireza actually got in the game, which you will see in a moment, there's a very large difference in that specifically this rook is on e5 and not on e8. And I think just visually, if you compare this position with the one black got a bit later, it's quite clear that having excellent control over the open files and a lot of play in the center has to be preferred to the slightly passive position that Alireza ended up getting in the game. He played knight e6, queen d2, queen f6, king b1. There is now a stabilization phase sort of for both sides. People are developing pieces to good squares. Knight b4 is an important move here. White would like to land the knight on d5, of course, but that can be stopped. Alireza played d5 here, setting up a nice streak which Fabiano quite clearly wasn't going to fall for, ending with this very typical rook c1 motif, and black is just instantly completely winning. After d5, Fabiano played rook hf1, which is a very logical move. You have to kind of keep an eye on the pawn on f4. But it was also, interestingly, in particular, like considering the themes of the late game in this game, it was very possible here to consider the move h3, h4. Not to play h5, of course. h5, g5, I think, would favor black in most cases. But just to make it harder for black to play g6, g5 himself. And then we want to play a4, supporting this guy, perhaps creating a square on a2 for the king. And then I guess the ideal scenario for white is we get to play knight before d3, and we get to play rook d1, f1, putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on f4. And as a matter of fact, the computer instantly goes rook c5, a4, f3, and still prefers white after something like queen f2. And once again, I want to bring your attention to this rook on d8, which really, if you compare some kind of a position like this with a position like this, where both of black's rooks are extremely active and are on very good squares in the center, I think it's easy to see why Alireza's choice was not as strong. But Fabi played rook hf1, rook c5, a4, d4, knight d3, rook f5. And it seems like black sort of stabilized, and black still has the 4 pawns for the piece. And originally, when we were looking at this during the live show, we couldn't even sort of properly figure out who is to be preferred here. But I think eventually lack of proactive ideas for black is the most telling thing about this position, and white will eventually start making progress. Rook f3 is actually a very nice move, stopping f4, f3 counterplay. White is not really threatening much. Probably the most clear productive idea here for white would be, if it doesn't lose any material to, I don't know, some kind of knight g5 tactics, is bishop c6, e4, getting this rook to go somewhere. And mainly I think it's just very, very difficult for black to find productive moves. And the computer already suggests playing something like h5 here, which is a useful move, gaining some space on the king side and also not committing to g6, g5 yet. But Alireza supported the pawn on f4 with g5, which is also very difficult to criticize. Now Fabiano played rook g1, which is a clever move. And this is maybe the sounds a bit harsh, but it might be the last important turning point in the game. White quite clearly wants to play h3, h4. The intention, I mean, the idea of rook g1 is to stop h4, g4. You, of course, do not want to allow this. And after rook g1, black really had to play h7, h5, once again saying, I am not going to allow h4 without a fight. And after h5, the computer suggests playing bishop c6. Black goes king f8. King f8 is a kind of an all-purpose useful move, unpinning the pawn on g5, just putting a king closer to the center for potential later game. And there's a very funny line here, which goes bishop b4, rook has to go to a5, and now we go b4, rook takes a4, and knight b2. And shockingly, this rook is this rook is actually gone now. But black can play b5, knight a4 and ba, and we arrive at a very weird position where black has 5 pawns for the rook, and the white king is somewhat bare, and the computer still prefers white here, but nowhere near as much as it will start preferring white in the game. So this is still quite a mess. And also, looking at this and discussing some of the variations that happened later in the game as well, it brought me back to a childhood memory, which I want to briefly share with you. I can't exactly recall which book it was in, but one of the most vivid memories of a single game I've read about when I was a kid. I'm pretty sure it was a book of Mark Taimanov's, I just can't recall what it was called, in which he told the story of, I think it was the last round of one of the Soviet championships. And yeah, it's a 1969 Soviet championship in which I think he had to play sharply for a win in the last round against Grandmaster Lutikov, who was a very, very sharp tactician. And you can find that game in all major databases, so I'm not going to show you the game in its entirety. It's long and complicated, and there were a lot of changes of assessment there. But basically, looking at this position, I was very much reminded of a position in the Taimanov-Lutikov game. For instance, some kind of a position like this, where once again black has a lot of pawns for the rook. One of them is on a2, which obviously helps, but it's not the only reason why black is doing well here. And Taimanov went on to win this game. It was a very, very exciting game. As I said, featuring fantastic tactical complications. Not all of them played perfectly, but it's very, very difficult to play perfectly when the position is as complicated as it was in that game. So minor derail over, and as mentioned, black really should have played h5 here. Instead, Alireza played king f8, h4, h6, hg and g, rook h3, and somewhat shockingly, here, the material balance is still arguably in black's favor, but the computer has already started indicating that this position cannot be defended for black because of just how strong the idea of doubling on the h-file and then starting to harass the black pieces is. And another slight flashback to the Lutikov Taimanov game here is that black can and arguably should take on b5 here, a b queen f5, rook e7 check, sorry, rook h8 check, king e7, rook d8, king d8, and we pick up the pawn on d5, once again landing in this exact material balance, rook for 5 pawns. Oops, not rook f1. But here, after rook e1, queen b5, rook e5, I do not believe that black is doing all that well, and the computer doesn't believe it either. Endgames actually could be quite tricky here for white, but I don't think black survives to actually play an endgame in this position. I think the pawns just start getting taken apart if white plays precisely. Alireza played f3 instead. Here the cruel computer says you can even ignore it and play rook gh1, let's say g4, rook h8 check, king e7, queen b4 check, and black suddenly starts running out of squares. After knight c5, rook e1 check just wins on the spot, and if you play rook c5, you can even play rook 8 h6, queen f5, rook 1 h5, and somewhere around here black starts giving up all of his material because otherwise he just gets mated. It's also quite strong to play in a more prosaic fashion, just to stop the pawn on f3 with queen f2, and eventually black just once again gets torn apart. Something like king e7, rook gh1, g4, rook h6, queen g5, queen g3, and once again, 43 channels, 43 channels, but nothing to watch. So many squares seemingly for the black pieces, but none of them good. And eventually, either the kingside structure will completely fall apart, or the king on e7 will get mated. Bishop c4, which is a move Fabiano played, is also very strong. The computer suggests it's time to start giving up some of your material, playing f2, rook f1, let's say rook c, oops, not rook b8, rook c8. But after, let's say, b2, b3 in this position, white just starts slowly and meticulously picking up those pawns, and this one is clearly already a goner, and it's just the first one, I think, in a long line of pawns which will not survive. Instead, Alireza played king e7. He was also running quite short on time here, so I think some of this was a little bit of time trouble panic. Bishop takes e6, king takes e6. This move is kind of horrible, but the improvement computer suggests is playing f2, rook f1, and taking with the queen here. And white just takes on f2 with the knight. Obviously, rook f2, queen f2, followed by queen takes f7 is not workable. Rook e1 now is a very large threat, and white is just objectively this is just winning. This is no longer better for white. White wins here if he doesn't go crazy. After king e6, white has queen h2, and this is sort of the major difference between including f2 immediately and not doing it, because now the threat of rook h6 is just crushingly strong. Alireza played f2 here, rook f1, king d7, rook h6, queen e7, rook takes f2. And the problem for black is that not only is his most important passer now gone, but also his king on d7 is very, very weak and will actually get chased down. Rook f2, queen f2, king c8 was the final move before the time control. And now, to Fabi's credit, the position is completely winning, but he chose, I think, by far the cleanest way to finish the game off. There are all kinds of strong moves here for white, but a5 is by far the best. It's actually very difficult to deal with the threat to the pawn on b6, because if you after rook d6, I think white finally just simplifies into a completely winning endgame. Alireza took on a5, and now queen c2 check, king b8, knight c5 check, and basically this creates an absolutely unbeatable threat of, let's say, after g4 we go queen h2 check, queen c7, knight a6 is impossible, so you go in the corner, and you get driven out of the corner and mated on c8. And understanding this, Alireza played rook d6, at least putting something in the way of the queen h2 check. But now rook h8, rook d8, king b3 check. Black has to go forward because after king c8, white quite funnily gives mate by taking on d8, trading one of his attackers, and both this and these are quite cute mates with the both of the remaining attacking pieces. And after king c7, queen b7, king c5, rook h6 check, f6, and knight e4 check. Black resigned because obviously everything is falling apart, and after king e6, white could somewhat sadistically even pick up this guy with check, and here play, for instance, rook f6, queen f6, and queen c6 check, continuing to collect material for nothing. And Alireza resigned. So this little sequence between the second and the last rest day did not go particularly well for Alireza. He lost a painful game to Carlsen and a very, very interesting and a double-edged game to Caruana, but still it is 0 out of 2 against the world's top 2 players. But he continues doing very well in the tournament, just not as sensationally well as he was doing until those 2 games. In terms of tournament standings, Magnus also won in round 10. He won a very easy, from the outside, the easy-looking game against Vladislav Kovalev, who did not respond to a quirky idea in the opening particularly well and was more or less busted by move, 20 certainly, maybe even slightly earlier than that. But with this victory by Fabiano Caruana, he is still leading the tournament going into the final 3 rounds. He is on +4. Magnus is his closest pursuer on +3, and Wesley So and Jordan van Foreys, who continues to be playing very, very well, are in tied 3rd and 4th on +2. Alireza Firouzja drops back to +1, but as I said, it's still a very, very creditable result. It's just that he did not score any points against the top two players in the world, which can happen to anybody. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Our coverage of the Vaikanzai Tata Steel tournament continues tomorrow, same time, same place, 1:30 Central European. So tune in for our live shows. But for now, I'm signing off. I once again thank you for watching this video. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.